Hey, everybody. Welcome back to The Collective. We have an awesome show lined up for you today, as per normal, and we're going to dive right in unless anybody's got any burning thoughts, questions,
Just good to
concepts.
see everyone.
Yeah, good to go. Trav, you were talking about something in the green room there. What did you want to...
Well, you brought something up. You
Oh,
were
yeah.
talking about an episode.
Yeah.
Did you want to? Do you want to just quickly say
Sure.
that?
Yeah, I'll dive right into it.
Sure.
So I'm in a depressive episode right now, and this is the best depressive episode I've ever actually had in terms of physical energy. And because normally in the past, what has been happening is when I hit that depressive episode, my energy drops to such a degree that it is difficult to do anything. And so my energy stores throughout the day are used up in the small things of like getting the kids dressed and getting them food and getting them off to school. And then I try to save energy for those moments, because if I don't have a lot of energy, then I get really snappy, and there's a whole bunch of other issues with that. But this particular episode, I am definitely in, but the communication style of this has helped to such a degree that I don't feel as down emotionally. Like I can feel physically that I am not performing at the rate that I would normally, but I'm not emotionally down as hard. I've been attributing it to the continual conversation and the fact that every day I wake up and I get excited, like, sweet, I'm going to have an awesome conversation with some cool people. And then I get to enjoy it every day. And it fills my cup a little bit every time. So that's what I was talking about. What was the segue you wanted to jump into?
Well, it brought to mind two thoughts. And the one, which is what I said, it's amazing how having a purpose can put depression on the back burner. It doesn't go away, but having a purpose, something that you're striving towards on a daily basis, that's going to be desirable to you, will help mute the effects of that depressive episode. And that was the one thought. You know, people know the formula: exercise, limit the substance, right? Limited substances are things that you might be using to cope with it. Have a purpose, something that's desirable to move towards. But I'm doing a podcast tomorrow with somebody you've done a podcast with in the past. And that's Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. I guess it would be Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman.
I called him Lieutenant Colonel.
Did you really?
I did, yeah.
And so you've had him on your podcast. You've got a very successful Tools for the Toolbox. People look at you as a role model when you're out there, which is awesome that you're speaking publicly about it. But as it came up, it was something that I had as a teenager on one of my binders I had written down. And there's a fellow by the name of Edwin Arlington Robinson. And he apparently had a sad life, sad childhood, a bit of a depressive individual in himself. Didn't get named until he was a toddler, or I think he was around 6 months old. And his parents were out at some resort, and they're like, "What do you mean you haven't named your kid?" And so they put names into a hat, and they pulled it out, and the guys who chose Edwin, he got the winning name, and he happened to come from Arlington. So they're like, "Oh, we'll call you Edwin Arlington Robinson." And he had a poem that he put out, and it was called Richard Cory. Have you guys heard that one before?
No.
I have not, no.
Okay, so if I can remember that one, let's see. It was, whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from soul to crown, clean-favored and imperially slim. And he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked. But still he fluttered pulses when he said good morning, and he glittered when he walked. And he was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace, and fine we thought him to be everything, to make us wish we were in his place. And on we worked, and waited for the light, and went without the meat, and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer's night, went home and put a bullet through his head. And that poem always kind of stuck with me. And I think about people that we see in daily life who are Richard Corys, who might not be vocal about what it is that's going through. We look at them and say, hey, they've got it all put together. Look at this hugely successful person, daily basis putting out content. And people might be watching you right now and thinking that. And it's those people that I tend to look out for the most, the people who look like they have it all put together, because we're all dealing with demons. We all have some sort of struggle that we're dealing with. That was what went through my head, and that's it.
Yeah, that's
That's
awesome.
awesome.
Yeah, first off,
Mhm.
I'm thoroughly impressed that you pulled off that from memory. Well done.
Hey, there you go.
I feel like such an underperformer right now.
Right?
I feel like I need therapy.
So some things stick, other things gone. Forget
Yeah.
about it.
So yeah, and I completely agree with you. I've seen lots of people who we think are good to go, and they're kicking butt, and they're doing awesome things, and then you hear about in the background all of the pain and all of the things. I mean, what actually brings to mind is you think of like Robin Williams, always constantly striving and doing cool movies and comedy shows, and always hilarious and really great with the fans, and always happy to help and do whatever he can, and battle depression for years and years and years and years. And it's insidious. If you don't actually talk about it, if you don't bring it up into the light, you think that you're the issue. You're the only one, right? Everyone else, as you said earlier, everyone else is happy. What is wrong with me? And
I think
go
there's
ahead.
a delicate way to talk about it too. I mean, some people, they become their depression.
Mhm.
They will talk about it, and that will be their excuse for why they're acting in a certain way or why they feel a certain way. I
Yep.
think it's hyper important for people to recognize it and normalize it in the same way as if I get punched in the face, like we're talking about earlier, and I've got a black eye, everyone's going to say, oh, it looks like you got punched in your face. That black eye will subside. You'll get on with things. And you accept that, and they accept that. With depression, though, oftentimes people think, what the hell is wrong with me? But they've been punched in the emotional face, and it will subside at some point. It will get better. And the fact that you feel this badly at the moment just means that there's going to be the opposite side to that. When we were talking about balance in the previous podcast, you can't measure one without the other. The normalization in talking about it, I think, has to also be accompanied with the fact that this isn't something that we wear as a moniker.
Yeah, and it actually goes into actually what Shaun and I were talking about earlier, was the fact that if you hold on to any one identity, any identity, whether it be, I suffer with depression, or I was a JTF2 sniper elite pathfinder, right? You can hold on to anything if you want to. It's the idea of growth and development and constant learning. And actually, it's a great segue into one of the points I was going to talk about, is that we were talking about this yesterday. It was the escapism of books required to learn lessons.
If you
And not
don't
just
mind,
books.
before we jump into that, I
Yeah,
just want
sure.
to make two comments, two observations.
Sure.
And the first observation was this: you started off the conversation with, so when I get into a depressive episode, I normally, and then you paused, and then you said, "Oh, in the past." And so that's a really important observation. Not my observation. I mean that comment that you made when you observed yourself and made that correction. Because if anyone wants to get locked into a pattern of stuck in depression, well, start using the word normally, because now you're projecting the future.
Correct.
Normally means I'm always normally going to be in this. But you corrected that and then said in the past. And that's a recognition that this cycle that you're in right now was better than the previous cycles. And one of the reasons that I think it's better, to your point, is you raised the idea that these conversations are helpful for you. You look forward to them, and et cetera. And so then the comment was made by Trav through the poem, which is mind blowing that you could remember all that. It's about a guy who on the surface appears to have it all together, but then he goes home and he doesn't have it together. And so that's what's been happening with you on the surface, where you're in front of the camera and you're doing well and we're having these conversations and etc. But then who's checking in on you when you're not in front of the camera? I freaking am. When we're in the green room, my question to you is this: how long did we talk yesterday in the green room after we stopped recording? Any idea?
It was it would have been about an hour and a half.
Nearly 2 hours. And what did we talk about? All kinds of things. I
All
mean, at
kinds of
one
stuff.
point we were talking about how you were going to strategize your BJJ tournament opening move in the first 10 seconds. Am I wrong?
Oh no, that was awesome.
And so did we normalize like your day in the green room where nobody heard a freaking thing about what we were talking about?
Yeah.
I think we did.
Yeah.
And so it's not just the overt conversations that occur out in the public eye. It's the quiet conversations in the background that nobody ever gets to hear or see or get involved in. Those are also normalizing moments. So it's good to put yourself out there and talk with people in the spotlight. But there's also another piece, and that's do it quietly in the shadows if you have to, and do that work there. And by work, I don't mean like it's all burpees, because it doesn't have to be hard. It's just do the thing that you need to do in order to improve yourself, which perhaps is a segue into now grab a freaking book.
Before we get into that, does Sam or Matt, you got any thoughts on normalization? I'm glad I had this ticker up already. Just waiting for it. Sam, Matt, either one, you want to jump on? What do you got? Thoughts?
Yeah, you're talking about purpose, and I think that's even in the sense of like micro purpose, like hopping on a call like this is you're setting the platform for not normalizing it, but putting it out there to like strong leaders like yourselves and saying like, hey, I struggle with depression, and that talks to someone on the other side of the camera to say, oh, it's okay that I am struggling with this. I don't have to go home and just hold it in. I can talk in privately to people I'm close with, mentors, masterminds, groups like this. And I can also share that openly on something like this and give people that trust and knowing that we all struggle at some point, right? That doesn't mean we have to continue to. And that's the change of vocabulary, saying, I'm doing better than I was before, right? You're not putting yourself in that position. That purpose of actually saying it out loud gives you that purpose in the moment to know that you're probably impacting someone else on the other side of the camera to start their journey of not normalizing it, but normalizing in the sense that it's okay that they're going through that and to work through that themselves.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that.
Yeah, absolutely. This is, again, if I can't be an example to not be, then I think you should, if I can't be an example for you to follow, then I should be an example for what not to do. But I hopefully can keep pushing myself to be the example to follow. But Sam, you got any thoughts on depression, normalization, anything?
Yeah, well, I think we can all agree that the key word is purpose. But then when people throw that word out there, it's about finding your purpose, isn't it? And how do you do that? And you do that by knowing what your core values are. And I don't think a lot of people sit and really address what are my core values. And when you work that out, then you can live in your purpose. It's not something you work towards. It's something you can live in every day. So I think that's paramount. And then when you're talking about, if you're talking about depression, you're talking about a mental illness. Essentially, it's not just feeling sad. And with things like that, it's about what you're doing here, creating a toolbox of essentially, I look at it like life rafts. So you build up all these tools of what to do and be consistent in those tools. Don't wait for the dip of depression to come and go, I'm going to apply these tools. Do them consistently every day. That's why routines and healthy habits are so key. So then when you do go through those low points, which we will all go through in life, because that is life, we maybe don't go so deep, and we have the keys to be able to come out of it. And also sometimes it's accepting that sometimes life is a plateau. We're not always on that slope upwards. We have to accept sometimes that we're on the plateau. So just be consistent, and discipline, I think, is the key word with that. But the word normalization that you're talking about there, it's an interesting word because that can be dependent on culture.
It is.
Yep.
So many things affect normalization. So it's an interesting word that you're throwing out there, which I'm sure people can debate about.
Yeah, and I think there's it depends on how you interpret it, right? Is normalization just making it okay that whatever it is happening is okay, or is normalization the idea that the concept is okay in terms of like depression it's out there. People suffer from it. It's a horrible thing to deal with. But what are we normalizing? The bad feeling of depression or the battle against it? Right? So there's that interpretation of normalization in and of itself. But
And
I
I'd
wouldn't
be
mind throwing.
interested to know. Oh, sorry, go on.
no, you go ahead, Sam.
I'd be interested to know, like you're over in Canada. So I was actually talking about this today with a group. So over here, if you were to tell people that you were in therapy, there's a lot of stigma attached to that over in the UK still. It's not the norm. When we look at America, who we always kind of think are around about 10 years ahead of us in many ways, in certain things, the way we view America is everyone would have a therapist and it would be talked about in a normalized way. So people would go, "Oh, I said this to my therapist last night." That would not be a normal conversation over in the UK. I'd be interested to know in Canada, what's the normal with things like therapy and the stigma of mental health in general or mental ill health.
That's a good question.
I'd like to
Shaun?
jump on that.
Yeah, by all means.
So first off, I just want to recognize that Tim Turner, or Army Sergeant Major, and Dre, or Gray Man Dad, had just put up comments talking about how they struggle also with these kind of mental health challenges. And I mean, I know those two dudes. I mean, I worked alongside of Tim. And here's what I love about their comments stating that they're struggling with this is that very comment, that very conversation helps normalize the fact that guys who are sometimes held up on pedestals, or guys who are looked at as leading examples within their community, or guys who are leading the charge, as it were, or guys that are literally a poem. Well, by claiming or stating or owning the fact that they also struggle, it then makes the conversation normalized. Now, mental health challenges, or depression as the example, the old saying back in the day in special operations was normalize the abnormal. So you're always facing abnormal, and it's your job to normalize it and get on with it. But that doesn't work for mental health. You can't just like special operations depression. But what you can do is you can normalize the conversation by stepping up, putting a little bit of a spotlight on yourself and say, "Hey man, I got struggles. And here's what I'm trying to do. And this is the conversation that I'm trying to open up." And if I can use myself as an example, I'll simply state this. The only reason I'm in front of this microphone is to do literally this, is to have this entire conversation on the regular ever since I started this. And here's why. Because I struggled with things. I saw some statistics. I recognized the suicide. I've actually mentioned on Travis's podcast, which I was on, about suicide. My teenage brother killed himself because of the difficulties of teenagehood. And so suicide is a problem. Depression is a problem. There's many mental health issues out there that are problems, but the problems don't get reduced until we start normalizing the conversation about it happens to a lot of people that you don't expect. And we got to figure out as a community how to start talking about or normalizing the conversation about these very subjects.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts on that? I was going to answer your question, Sam. I think it's more normal than it used to be. That's for sure. I know more people that have therapists in general, and we do have conversations that usually start with, "Oh yeah, I was talking to my doctor the other day, and I came up with this." So those conversations are happening. But then again, my circle is full of broken people, for lack of a better word. It's not broken people, but like guys that struggle, gals that have a hard time, that have been in very difficult places. Like I talk to a lot of vets, right? And we all struggle, but I also have a lot of civilian friends that struggle as well. So being in that circle, I hear about it more often, I think, maybe, versus someone who has never been to a therapist or has never even thought that that was a normalized thing. So maybe yes and no, kind of 50-50. Matt, what's your thoughts on
And I've
this?
never been to a therapist
Oh, there you go.
ever.
Sean's never.
Because when I left the military, as I mentioned, I got handed no paperwork.
Smoke bombed it.
So I didn't even know there was a thing called Veterans Affairs Canada up until just 3 years ago. So, for plus of 2 decades, I got zero help, zero therapy, zero, square root of zero. And so, I've never seen a therapist, but guess what kind of therapy I enjoy? I had to find my own because I didn't have anyone, holding my hand and guiding me. And I don't mean that negatively in the sense of holding my hand. I'm just simply saying there was no one. And so I had to figure it out myself. This is what works for me, what I'm doing right now, simply talking. Call it talk therapy, call it hanging out with some dudes and talking about things, whatever you want to call it, whatever works for your head. But here's what works for me is simply talking.
Yeah.
And I find that to be extremely valuable. And I also like listening. I find that to be extremely valuable. And so these kind of things that we're doing, these live chats, etc., they're not just helping me. I've been told that they're helping a number of people who also don't want to go and see a therapist. This is their form of therapy. Now, the tricky part on that is, I'm not going to say it's our responsibility to do it really well, because there's actually people who are really paying attention right now and are kind of not hanging on every word, but are being shaped in the moment in a sort of guidance manner. And I don't feel responsible for that, but I'm trying really hard to do my best to help anyone out there like me who doesn't jive with therapy, but jives with this. So that's just a thought.
Yeah, I think the key thing also is that as much as you hear, as we were going to talk about in the books too, as much as you read or as much as you hear, you still have to put the work in.
There's when we talk about normalization, I think the key to that is for people to be able to self-identify. And there's an audio piece on TikTok that some people use as a bit of a comedy piece. A guy's like, oh, I enjoy wine, I enjoy beers, and but I have a hard time stopping at one. I just keep drinking. And the other person says, well, that's alcoholism. You're an alcoholic. He's like, oh, is that what it is? And it's meant as a comedy piece, and people will put images of themselves drinking around that. But there are people out there that don't realize what's happening in their life is going to be alcoholism or is going to be depression. And the normalization, I think, needs to be done in a way where the individual can identify what works for them and that there are other people out there going through things that maybe are similar, or they can draw tools from the toolbox.
Perhaps.
When we talk about therapy, Shaun, you say, I got the square root of zero in terms of therapy. Well, when I was in grade 3, I was going to be shipped off to a boarding school because I was too much to handle, and instead was put on the highest dosage of Ritalin in the province after being diagnosed by a slew of therapists. Got into some trouble. Some were court-appointed therapists, some weren't. I've seen a gamut of them through my childhood growing up and have the ability to speak on that a little bit. There is a social stigma, definitely, around people saying, much like in the UK, and I guess the circles that people run in, there can be a social stigma around that. But where none of us are qualified to be giving any clinical therapy sort of advice, we can lead by example. And my observations from going through a slew of them through my childhood is there are some that might be really good, but unless they can speak to you and your experience, unless you can relate or they can relate to you, you're wasting your money.
Yeah, 100%.
And if you're able to find something that's relatable outside of therapy, whether it be watching something like this or seeing a role model who has been through things, that's as a legitimate of a way to self-recovery as paying the money to go see somebody and talk about things ad nauseum or be prescribed with medications for symptoms as opposed to actually addressing the problem. So the normalization, I think, for individuals needs to be, there is a conversation out there. I can recognize there are points of this that I also feel, and now there's going to be action that I have to take. And maybe that is see a therapist, maybe it is medication, maybe it is these different things, but that's not going to be blanket for everybody. But the simple rules, exercise, diet, limit substances, purpose, those go a long way.
Yeah, 100%. Matt, you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, you're asking if it's kind of been normalized to see a therapist in Canada, and I think it has, and I think more so in the past 2.5 years during the pandemic. And I
Yeah.
think it happened. What I noticed is when people were stripped away of what they identified as, meaning, hey, this is my job, or this is what I find security in, right? So then they're lacking this purpose in what they did. That's what they identified and found their value in. Kind of like you're saying, Sam, is you need to have these core values that are independent of what you do or don't do as a person.
Mhm.
And I think that's where a lot of people did some what's called soul searching and saying, like, oh, I don't know how to navigate myself in this world, because as an example, I own a gym, and that was really tough to own a gym during the pandemic, right? Especially in
No doubt.
Canada. And I started to realize that I started to put my identity and value around my success as a business owner. And I learned that you need to create these rhythms, these routines, these habits, and these core values, and find the purpose outside of what you do or don't do, and have people in your corner that you can talk to and get a better understanding of who you are. And I think normalizing having someone to talk to, whether it's a therapist or listening to things like this, right? Because I think stories go a long way. And I use this example in our gym setting a lot. Is we have a strength and conditioning program that helps people get out of chronic pain. But I, under no means, am going to help someone who broke their arm. Right? They should go to the doctor. They should see physiotherapists. But I can give them tools if they're in chronic pain to get them going in the right direction and work with other professionals. So I think it's the collaboration, and I think a lot of people just probably have this stigma around the word therapist. They think they're broken or they're not worth anything, which is not the case, right? You just need to think of it as a way that you're taking care of yourself so you can be more to other people around you.
Absolutely. We have some great comments here that I wanted to share because they're so applicable. Winter Storm 47, again, breaking the heat, man. Well done, first off. I recognize my mental health struggles and the effects it had on my loved ones first, then began to see it in me. It took them being changed before I acknowledged it. And this exact same thing happened to me with my kids and my wife. And I did not recognize I had any issues up until I saw them change to adapt to me. And that was where I started looking inwards, because they were changing to me too. And that happens regularly in a mental health struggle, especially with post-traumatic stress, where what is normalized is survival versus actual living.
I disagree with that.
Well, sorry, he continued. We'll get back to you, Shaun, one second.
Yeah, you will.
Continue. I believe the therapist job isn't to solve your problems, but to get you talking. If things like this gets you talking, then mission successful. 100%. Exactly. What I was going to carry on with in that was the key thing is to get you to actually look at the issue, right? Because if you just keep it in your head, regardless of what it is, if it's just in your head and it's never something that you can physically either look at or talk about out externally from yourself, then your mind will just wrap circles around you. It's like sitting in any kind of choke from jiu-jitsu or being strangled by a boa constrictor. Like, it will just slowly squeeze the life out of you unless you bring it out to action, because action is the way to go. But Shaun, what was your point on PTSD?
I'll keep it brief. So I'll simply mention my story, and then whoever's listening can determine what they want to determine from it, rather than me posing this is the reality of things. So when I left the military, when I left special operations, as I mentioned, I didn't get any paperwork. I didn't know about any of these things. And so I thought it was normal to have nightmares every night.
Mhm.
And I did that for over 20 years. And my sleep sucked and this and that. And, it's negatively impactful not to get deep sleep. And so eventually my wife convinced me that I should probably talk to someone. I talked to my family doctor, and my family doctor said, interesting. I didn't know that about you, Shaun. Let's talk more. And we talked about 10 hours. And then she referred me to a psychiatrist where I went through a formal diagnosis. And the psychiatrist said to me, Shaun, you have PTSD. And I blinked and took about 3 seconds to process that. And my response to her was, okay, good. And she said, what? What do you mean good? I said, good. Now I know what it is. That's what it's called. Okay. Now I can start learning about it. I didn't know. PTSD when I left the teams wasn't a word.
No.
It wasn't 4 letters combined. It just wasn't. And so I didn't know anything about it until, well, I started learning a little bit about it before I talked to that psychiatrist. But when she told me straight up, you've got hardcore PTSD, I was happy to hear that, man. Like, call it a label or whatever, but I just called it, now I've got something that I can try to figure out. And that's what I've done ever since she told me that. I've been on a full frontal assault against PTSD for myself in order to improve not only my education in it, not only my processes to crush it, but my ability to see the devil in the details of all things PTSD. So I think that my approach is not for everyone, but there are many approaches to manage these kind of things. And I don't want to pigeonhole anyone in the sense of the moment you hear you've got PTSD, straight to the therapist. There's many ways to skin a cat, as the old saying goes. And my way is not every way, but there's many ways to do it. That would be my only point.
That's a great point and a great clarification, because you're right. There are many ways to skin a cat. Many, many ways. And, it actually this is one of the other points we were talking about. And why anybody got further points on that before we slide into a topic here? Or?
Well, I wonder, Shaun, if you said that the lack of sleep you thought was normal. So there's a normalization process for you, and you would feel, I'm sure, the consequence of lack of sleep. You'd be tired, it'd affect the mood and all the rest, but this is normal. Would your response have been different if you didn't think it was normal? If you thought there's something truly wrong with you?
100%. But this is my way. And this is what was taught to me. I don't want to say I was institutionalized, but I was created to kick ass.
Right.
And so in kicking ass for that long, I just got used to it. And I got used to feeling like, man, you've always got the weight of the world on your shoulders, called a massive rucksack, and a whole pile of things to do, called the mission. And you just get after it. And you're just used to being in the hurt locker all the time. And so when I left the teams, I was just used to overperforming in an underperforming capacity. You're always used to being tired, hungry, cold, wet, blah, blah, blah. I was used to that. In fact, I kind of liked it. And so as I left the teams, I was just used to getting after it on 0 sleep for 1,000,000 years. And that's my mind. That's what I was taught to do. So what was normal for me is abnormal for most people. I just didn't see the abnormality of it until someone said, dude, do you know it's not? In fact, it was my wife's sister, my sister-in-law, who said to me, who kicked this whole thing off. I was walking downstairs. She looked at me and she said, how'd you sleep? And I said, not that well. Well, what does that mean? No big deal. And she dragged it out of me that, nightmare, 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 nightmare. And she said, that's not normal. So the moment that she said that, I thought, maybe it isn't. And that was the start of what I came to realize was PTSD. And of course, there's many other things involved with PTSD other than just not sleeping well. But until someone kind of parted the curtains just a crack, and I could look in and say, oh, that's what it's all about. Once I saw that, I could get on with it. But until it got labelized, I was just trying to do my best. Yeah. As it turns out, by labelizing it, now I can do way better.
And
go ahead, Trev.
So the fact that you were functioning and probably functioning at a high level, despite
So I was told.
right, despite the lack of sleep and everything else, to me would suggest that our own perception of our abilities or what's going on means more than really anything else. And somebody who normalizes a lack of sleep will be able to carry that heavy ruck all the way up until the point where they don't. However, if somebody looks at themselves and say, there's something wrong with me, I'm not sleeping, I'm crabby, this is going on, what's wrong with me? People can get in a downward spiral of always looking at what's wrong, as opposed to me, the idea of normalization is, this is a completely natural psychophysiological response to the stresses that I've encountered in my life experience. And if I'd like to go somewhere else, or if I'm going to seek something that I see to be more desirable or more positive, I now have a label I can put on it and I can take steps towards it. So I think for me, the real key is for people not to get hung up in a diagnosis, not to be normalized in the way that this is me, I'm depressed. This is me, I've got PTSD. It's just for people to be able to contextualize and say, what I'm feeling right now maybe isn't great, but I'm not abnormal.
Yeah, I don't like the victim mentality.
Yeah.
I never have. Certainly not for myself, and I actually don't appreciate it in others. If you want to run your program as a lifelong victim, we're probably not going to get along over the long term. And so, for all the victim mentalities out there, and I think every person that I've met has at some point in their life felt like a victim, but it shouldn't last for your entire life. And so that's something that I kind of never felt. I was always on the offense throughout my life. And so I'll clearly answer your question, Trav. If I would have known what was up 20 odd years ago, 100% I would have got on with fixing that, assaulting it, changing it. But I didn't know because I maybe I was just dumb by not knowing what was going on, but I just didn't know what was going on. But the moment that I was told, I started getting after it. And so to me, I don't want to say it's almost like a fun, challenging puzzle to solve. I don't want to say it's my new hobby that I'm looking forward to, but I treat it like not work, but I treat it like betterment. I look at PTSD as a betterment opportunity rather than whatever. There's a lot of negative language that's thrown at PTSD, like I suck because I got PTSD. I think completely the opposite, man. So I guess hopefully that answers your question.
Thank you.
It's a complex topic, and I mean, unfortunately, Shaun, you said you don't want to use the term institutionalized, but we all were. That's what basic training does, right? It institutionalizes you. Winterstorm says, I used to take pride in how much I could endure. I did the same thing. Someone had to take it on and continue on moving, but I didn't realize that being constantly forced to endure was not healthy. And that's 100% true. Even if you look at it physically,
it's hard to realize it if no one's telling you, and no one was telling us.
And well, that's the point, is that that conversation wasn't there. Right. And even when I was talking about my granddad back in 1945, he comes out of the military and no one's talking about trauma. No one's talking about anything. And for 70 plus years, he didn't talk to a soul to lighten that load even a little bit. And that was one of the points that, for me, the moment I got diagnosed, hey, you have PTSD and you have major depressive disorder, like, okay, now I can work on it. Now I can, I know exactly what it is. How do we engage it? Because if you don't engage it, then it just sits there. And I actually, very similar, Shaun, I wasn't sleeping as well. And it took me talking to my wife going, yeah, I'm still not sleeping well, even after I'd gotten posted to a new area, to actually realize it. I went into she was like, maybe it's just a sleep issue. Why don't you go talk to the doctor? Because we had been told about PTSD coming back from Afghanistan, but it wasn't like in depth. They were just like, hey, you should watch out for this. And it wasn't until I actually went in there and said, hey, I'm having a sleep issue, that they were like, oh, maybe we should talk to a doctor. And then eventually I got the through that system, I got the diagnosis, because I just thought it was a sleep issue.
I think people have to be careful in trying to seek comfort, though. and looking
Yes.
at this and looking towards, because there is purpose in pain, there is
Yep.
purpose in suffering, and finding that purpose will help guide a person through. And then when people constantly look for that comfort zone, I should be getting X amount of sleep, I should be happy every single day, that's not reality. And in fact, it's got the inverse effect. The seeking of happiness will actually create more unhappiness in an individual. And I think that should just be really on the forefront, in my opinion, in people who are looking to reach those goals.
Yeah,
I
I
see
agree.
that a lot in people
Sam?
creating like a safety bubble around themselves. So they do all the good things, but then what they do is while they're in that place, and that's an okay place, if you're now adding more tools and still developing, but if you're not, and then you go into a stressful environment, guess what? You can't deal with it because you've been living in a nice cozy bubble. So really good point.
Yeah. Eric actually added this to Travis's point. Things like nightmare and flashback can be scary and disruptive, but if you reframe it as the body naturally trying to relieve, not sure if that's supposed to be relive or relief, but and process certain events / feelings, it can be helpful. 100%. Again,
Agreed.
mindset, right? Sean harps on mindset all the time. This is what it is.
But not a stubborn mindset like I have,
Yeah.
which is what I've claimed I have. I'm freaking stubborn, man. I'm not like tough or smart or whatever. I'm just stubborn, and I've stubborned my way through life. And so I say it on a fairly regular basis. Don't be me, because I don't run a perfect program. And one of my character flaws is I'm freaking stubborn. And so, did I have to go that long not sleeping? Obviously not. But I'm just used to stubborning things. And I just thought I could stubborn my way through life. And I do even now, but at least I've got better sleep as I'm stubborning my way through life. And I sure would have liked that extra sleep 20 years ago, 100%. And as I've stated clearly in the past, I could be a lot better human being right now if I would have got 20 years of good sleep. I'm not going to claim that I'd be cracking the code of the DNA. I'm just saying I'd be a better person. I'd be a little smarter, a little stronger, a little faster, a little bigger, better, blah, blah, blah. But I would be more helpful to my community today if I would have got a bit better sleep to be able to provide a bit more in this conversation. So I frame it as maybe it was a bit disappointing that I didn't look after myself better, but I am a bit disappointed that I can't look after my team better today. I give myself a hallway pass on that because I just didn't know. I was just doing my best. But now that I know, I get after it by continuing to try to do my best for the team around me with the knowledge of, just got to crush that PTSD.
Yeah.
Who left that last comment there?
That was Eric Lister. Put it up again for you.
I think Eric's nailed it on the head, really. I think that mindset is the biggest portion to all of this. And when Shaun was saying, had I looked at this differently, I would be a different response to it. And I think that's the key for a therapist, is for them, sure, to talk, I agree, but for them to provide you a reframing of the situation you're in so you can look at it from a different perspective. And once your mind can shift, once you can, Viktor Frankl, a father of modern logotherapy in the concentration camps, that was his famous saying, right? He says, why is this person falling apart and this person's surviving or thriving and everything's been taken from them? And he says, what's the last thing that somebody can actually control in their life? He says, the one thing you can't take from me is the way I choose to respond to what you do to me. The last of life's great freedoms is one's ability to choose their own attitude in any given circumstance. So if something's happening to you, is it bad? Maybe, if you perceive it as bad. Is it a problem that we can now work on and start working through? Perhaps, if you perceive it that way. And I think Eric's nailed it there. Am I having nightmares? Is that a bad thing? Maybe. How am I going to approach this?
Yeah. It's actually kind of funny. I was just thinking about how the more stressful the environment, the more difficult the area, or the more suffering you're going through, the smaller the things you appreciate are. right? So when you first get into basic training and you're not getting any sleep, you're not doing any of the normal everyday stuff. You have to get your head shaved and all that stuff. The little things are the things that you attach. Those are the things you look forward to, right? When you are in the field and you're no sleep and your body's just in the hurt locker, as Shaun likes to say, those little chunks of sleep, those little 2 hours here, 45 minutes here, those are gold, right? Or you a fresh pair of socks. Those little things that in everyday life you'd be like, whatever, throw a pair of socks on, no big deal. It's not even a thought. And when you talk about trauma and the dealing with those things, it does come back down to the mindset of where your wins at. What are the things that you're looking for that are checks in the boxes, right? Shaun always likes to say, when we first got this started, I want to end the day on a win. Let's find a little win and run with it. And that way we can end the day on a win. And a lot of it comes back down to that. It's just a mindset, because you could brush over a win in a heartbeat. And sometimes you got to you'll see them if you're looking for them, but you got to be looking for them to see them. So
I just think quickly on that, just acknowledging as well that everybody's had different life experiences from childhood on to adulthood. So if you imagine, if you will, we've all got a stress bucket, and everyone's got a different size stress bucket because of their own life experiences. So we'll all be able to handle different stresses in different ways because of our own unique life experiences. So it's understanding how we all find ways to empty our own stress buckets, and it's about finding those tools. But trauma, it's showing now somebody will deal with trauma as an adult in the same way they dealt with trauma as a child, and how you were managed as a child with that trauma is how you're going to manage that trauma in adulthood, which is why you see people react to trauma in such different ways. It's I said, it's a deep subject that we can go into, but
well, this is why we're here. This is what the conversation is about, is to go deep into these things. So let's do it. Matt, you got any thoughts on this before anybody else?
No, I think you guys covered it quite well. Yeah, go ahead, Shaun.
What do you got, Shaun?
I was just going to say that, not to take it off on a tangent, but just to make this point for anyone who's listening to this out there, I was lucky that someone finally told me that I had PTSD. So what about anyone out there who's never been formally diagnosed with whatever thing that they feel inside is not really right, whatever that means to them? Well, if you don't want to talk to someone, if you don't want to go see someone, if you don't want to research what it is that you feel a little bit off, then maybe a very simple way to consider how to do things better is just sit down with yourself for a minute and ask what your worldview is, how negative or positive you are in respect to the world around you. Because if you're really negative, if you use a lot of words like they did this, they did that, they don't understand me, they screwed me over, them. If you're using that a lot in paragraphs or sentences, chances are you probably need to reframe your world view. Because if you're saying they screwed me over, chances are there's a lot of negativity in your life. And if you're not saying they a lot on a day-to-day basis, chances are that you've got a reasonably good worldview. But if something still feels a little off inside of you, by focusing on positive action or positive putting goodness out into the world, it's a way for you to take charge of your own life by doing good and then seeing how that feels to you. And if you're putting good out into the world and you still feel like, there's something a bit off, I don't know what it is, now might be a good time to go and talk to someone. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't talk to anyone right from the get-go. What I'm saying is, if you're reluctant to talk to someone about how you feel, check in with your worldview and check in with how often you're saying they screwed me over.
Go ahead, Sam.
I was just going to say, again, I don't know what it's like over in Canada, but over here, so when I left the military initially, I struggled with the transition from military to civilian life. I was institutionalized. I was struggling with identity. And I eventually went to a doctor. Our doctors over here, if you say that you're in the military, and you're feeling depressed and that you've seen combat, I spent just short of 2 years over in Afghanistan, 3 deployments. They'll throw that PTSD card at you straight away, straight on your medical documents, PTSD. I would also be cautious of taking that identity when they give you it, because I think people need to do a lot more than just try and go to a doctor and maybe seek medication or therapy. Little things like, are you drinking too much alcohol? Are you having a lot of unhealthy habits? Are you taking drugs? Are you actually getting outside in daylight? Are you going for walks? Are you doing exercise? What's your nutrition like? I could go on and on and on. What are you reading? What are your nutrition in the mind? All these things. And people will negate all that to go straight to a doctor to get a diagnosis, to get, the label that they can then live in and make that their identity.
It's the easy button.
And it took me, I took that label for probably 2 years, and then I went, no, this isn't working. Let's redefine who I am, and that's the change. If you want to change, then change. Change what you're doing.
I like that a lot.
100%.
And doctors don't necessarily know. They know the literature.
100.
They know what their peer groups say, but they're going to say something different when the DSM-6 comes out, because DSM-4 had a different definition for PTSD than DSM-5. They don't know. They're trying to figure it out too. So you probably know you better than anybody else. And if somebody's giving advice or providing tools that you think will work for you, utilize them. And just because a doctor is saying you have PTSD, you have ABC, look really long and hard. Don't be open to reasonable persuasion, and don't be against all the professional opinions, but realize that they're trying to figure it out too. And one doctor will give you a different diagnosis than another.
Yeah. This is the difference between learning and memorizing, right? A doc can memorize a diagnosis or a set of symptoms or a set of whatever, but the really good doctors are the ones that actually either know you, or they know the community, or I'm sure, Matt, you see this at the gym too. It's the difference between somebody that can memorize a bunch of exercises versus learning what those exercises are doing, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Go for it.
Yeah, if we're using that kind of gym setting or that analogy, the best coaches are the ones that know how to communicate what they want the person to do, right? So it goes far beyond teaching someone how to air squat, as an example. Like, you can know all the points of performance, and even if it's just nutrition, you can know macro count, you can know what they need to eat, when they need to eat. But if you don't know how to learn more about the person you're across from, or be more curious about them, how they receive information, and how your worldview will affect the way they're receiving information from you, it doesn't really matter, right? So there's a lot of good coaches in my industry that aren't in the industry anymore because they didn't know it, right? They memorized it. They memorized these tactics. They knew the habits to do, but they didn't know why. They didn't know the principles underneath, right? So principles are few, methods are many. And I think that's what it really comes down to is, I think you learn these things through experience. So if you can have a medical professional or a physician or a therapist that knows the education behind it, and has the knowledge, and has also been through it, like that's a big thing, right? So I think more and more people are starting to seek people like that out, and people who have gone through some pain in their life, right? The turning into purpose, like you're mentioning before. I think that's where some pretty cool impact can happen.
Yeah.
And
Shaun?
to add an additional layer to that, since we're mentioning coaching and coaches and what they can provide for you, and talking about finding a good doctor and etc., I was trying to be my own best doctor while I was spending 15 years being a high performance race coach around the world. And so if there's anything that I don't know about nutrition right now, it's because it hasn't been invented yet. Because I spent so many years trying to learn the most amount of information in the entire world about nutrition and hydration and how to perform at a world championship level for myself and for my athletes. So I knew things, but what I didn't know was that I had PTSD. And so, all of my focus from while I was in the military, like in order to get to tier 1, you just don't roll off the couch and not think.
Mhm.
You've got to be focused. You've got to be professional. You've got to seek. You've got to want the best out of yourself. You've got to be a relentless pursuer of excellence. That's what I was taught. That's what I did. That's what I've done all my life. That's what I do right till today. But all of that relentless pursuit of trying to be better was all focused in an area that was a broad battle space out in front of me that I just kept crushing without the understanding that I had PTSD. But the moment that I learned that, then I got onto target locking that and doing my best against that as well, always optimizing against the problem. And so for anyone out there who thinks that, if you crack open a magazine that has a one-page article on nutrition and that's going to sort things out for you, it probably won't. What you really do need to do is contact someone who has some deep experience on how to put all of these things together so that it works for you. But at the end of the day, all of the macro and micro nutrients in the world won't help you if you don't know what you're fighting against. And so you've got to understand what the task is in front of you, what your target lock is, and consider the correct approach for you. And so I know that Matt understands this very well within the business that he's in. Every solution is a unique or a boutique solution for the person who's standing in front of you. And it's your job as a coach to optimize them efficiently. But if we're looking at ourselves, that's still the same job where it's our job to optimize ourselves. But we need to know the fullness of what we're facing. And if we're unaware that our mental health challenge is called PTSD or depression or whatever, now we're operating against a battle space that we don't understand as well as we should. As soon as we're given that quote unquote label, it should be our first task to learn more about how to do it better. And if you can't do that by yourself, look around you to your left and right, and there's probably someone who can start guiding you a little bit, would be my point.
That is a great point. And to your point, my my initial engagement in therapy was not great. I went to the doctors that the Army said, go see these people. And I was like, okay. Being the young Master Corporal, I was like, oh yeah, sure. Okay. This is who they're sending me to. It must be good. And I spent a year getting worse every day. Every time I went there, it was not a good fit for me. And I didn't know that I could see anybody. And it took somebody saying, you can just go see anybody you want, right? I was like, what? But this is who I was. And so at that point, I did exactly. I started looking for trauma specialists. And once I found a trauma specialist, I started looking at what they were capable of doing. One of them said equine therapy. And I was like, hey, I like horses too. Let's do this. And once I contacted her and we started working together, I've been working with her for the last 6 years. Since then, it's just been consistent and the reason I'm staying with her is because she speaks my language. When we go see the horses and we work out in the field, she speaks my language. We're about the same age. We have the same vernacular. She comes from a history of trauma. She has her own issues. She's also a doctor and all of this stuff. So when she speaks from her experience, not just from the reading of the book, she can speak from her experience and her experience with other people with trauma. And then lays into me and tells me that I need to, in a very base terms, there's been times where I've been complaining and she's like, you're just complaining right now, right? I'm
Pick
like,
up your socks, Burls.
Exactly. And I've had her say stuff like that where it's just like, you need to harden up. I'd be like, oh yeah, I guess. Yeah, I do. But that's not for everybody. Because for some people, you tell them to harden up, they're going to crumble. So again, as you guys are all saying, it's like, it is a boutique thing and you have to find the right person or the right tool or the right thing to engage. Because as a very base example, I can use a wrench as a hammer. Doesn't mean I should. It's very simple. So we've been rolling. We're almost an hour now. Man, that just flew by. Well done, everybody. That was a great conversation. Any final thoughts? Normalization, difference between learning and memorizing? Sam, anything you got?
Well, I just you know, going off the subject of what we've been talking about, the difference between learning and memorization is obviously learning. It's all to do with actually having an understanding, isn't it? And failing, which is super important for learning. You know, and gaining that knowledge where memorizing, obviously, you're not gaining a whole lot in your life just by memorizing. I don't know if you had it in the military, but we had camp soldiers and field soldiers. You know, camp soldiers might be good at memorizing, but they're not so good at learning in the field. So I'd say that's the difference.
I called them regimental soldiers versus field soldiers and regimental soldiers. But
Okay.
any final thoughts, Trav?
No, I think it's been covered pretty well. Just
Hammer down.
Yeah, thanks for having me on this. I always enjoy the conversations.
It's awesome. These are awesome. I'm glad you were able to join us for this one too, because we went on a bit of a tangent right off the bat.
Touch and
but it
go.
was great.
Touch and go.
Matt, you got any final thoughts on either normalization, learning and memorizing? Your thoughts on it?
No, I think this has been fantastic. Appreciate being here. I think one thing is labeling to orientate yourself, to know where to go, but also not getting stuck on that label either, right? Not using it as an excuse to stay where you are.
Yeah, 100%. Shaun, you got any? Or Sam, you got something?
If I could have one request, could you cut Travis's poem of him saying it? I want to share that all over.
Dude, I was just stepping in here to say, you know, I don't even know what we talked about today. I'm still trying to figure out how to memorize that.
Something stick. I don't know.
That's gonna be it, man. Shaun, we got any final points though?
No, thanks for everyone for the conversation. I appreciate learning about these kind of things myself. Every time I have a conversation with cool guys, girls, cool guests, I always come away richer for it. So I really appreciate that. And I'll conclude my point with this. Anyone who is listening today and gain from this, that's why we're doing this. But don't think for a moment that we have fully covered the subject, because we've barely scratched the surface. It's a really deep, complex, nuanced conversation that could go on for days and days. And maybe we'll reconvene this exact same panel again and have this continuance of the conversation on this broad-ranging subject. And I'll leave that to Chance to do his wizard behind the curtain arrangement. And so thanks for joining us. If you feel a little off, consider why you feel a little off. And if you ever feel off enough that you don't know where to turn, hang out with us over here and figure out how to do things a little bit better maybe. Or you can always drop me a DM. I'm always happy to chat with anyone in my DMs, and I'm sure that would be the case for anyone on this panel as well.
Yeah, it it starts with you, right? Everything starts with you, right? Like everything that I need to sort starts with me. It ends with me. But I have no shame in getting help from people that have been there, that know how to help. And then I can, as Travis said, you start to pick your pieces, right? And you're like, ooh, that works. I'll take that, put it in my toolbox. I'll take that tool, put it in my toolbox. It's fantastic. This is how we all learn. And then we build and we grow. And if you can do it here with us on the collective, then awesome. We'll love to see you. We'll love talking with you. We'll see you all tomorrow. Have a great night, everybody. GMO.